Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
3 activists have been remanded in custody, charged with obstructing a train during climate protests in London. It's now day 4 of disruption caused by the group Extinction Rebellion. More than 480 people have been arrested, and the Home Secretary has said police must use the full force of the law against them. That's the orders from the top, but there are questions over how seriously some officers on the ground are taking them, as Ed Hauker reports.
The big number at the start of the 4th day of Extinction Rebellion, 428. That's arrests, and more followed. This is Oxford Street. So far, more than 1,000 officers have been deployed, many on 12-hour shifts. Peaceful protesters boast they've filled the holding cells, and Home Secretary Sajid Javid says police should be using the full force of the law against them. But are they? This was filmed on Tuesday on Waterloo Bridge. I met organiser Robin Boardman-Patterson there, and he says the protest is actually winning over police.
They've been very polite, you know, very respectful of the protest. A lot of them understand where we're coming from, and they don't want to react in the way that, you know, they don't want to have to be dragging off peaceful protesters. They want the government to be doing more.
You're kind of suggesting that a lot of the police are on your side, actually.
The ones I've spoken to certainly are. You know, I've been arrested 8 times in the last 18 months, and in the back of the van you have some really nice conversations, actually.
In the last couple of days, we've seen a mass protest about knife crime in London. It's an epidemic without question. It's devastating families. Isn't that where police priority should be, rather than a kind of symbolic protest?
Look, we don't want to waste, you know, police time. We're trying to create disruption in the City of London to highlight the extent of the emergency.
Is there a sense, a bit with protests like this, that they are a bit middle class? I mean, we're on Waterloo Bridge now. I mean, it's a bit like a farmer's market. Is protest a luxury event now?
If you do have that position in society, as you say, if you are a middle class, you have a greater responsibility to people. You have a greater responsibility for people from a poorer background, for people across the world that can't do the same things that you do. You know, Gandhi was from a higher caste within Indian society. Nelson Mandela was the chief of his tribe.
You've been branded a posh eco-loon. The charge is you've had your foreign holidays, you're now turning up and dictating to us how we should live our lives.
You know, pictures of me that whatever they shared, or, you know, the Sun, the Daily Mail, from when I was 14, 15, of me out in, you know, in France and in Italy, you know, and you know, that was who I am. You know, I'm an ordinary person. People go out on flying on holidays. And I didn't know the effects of climate breakdown so severely at that time.
We have an economy which has more and more people who work on 0 hours contracts, who only get paid the minute they turn up to work. If you're disrupting their ability to get there, you're taking money out of the pocket of some of the most unstable workers in Britain, aren't you?
And we're so sorry for doing that. We really don't want to be disrupting ordinary people's lives. People are going to face the effects of food shortages right here in the UK in the near future. That kind of disruption is totally necessary.
Extinction Rebellion planned disruption on the roads around Heathrow tomorrow. Will it be serious or symbolic? Is it necessary? People must judge for themselves.
Well, the climate change protesters accuse politicians of failing in their duty to act on global warming because they are compromised by a focus on profit and growth. So is that a fair charge? Our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is here. What's actually happened to our greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, Chris, first the good news. Since 1990, greenhouse gas emissions in the UK have come down by 44%. That's almost half, and it's been driven by 2 key areas of our economy. First, electricity, where emissions have fallen 59%, thanks largely because coal power has been phased out. And second, by business and industry, where emissions have fallen 41%. Again, that's thanks largely to the decline of big industry, heavy industry like steel and aluminium. Of course, the worry there is that production has simply moved from the UK and gone to countries like China.
Well, I mean, that may look good, but where does that leave us on our targets?
Well, in the short term, we're doing well. The issue emerges after 2023, where the Climate Change Commission has warned that we are dangerously close to missing our targets. And there are two big problems, and they're the most difficult to solve. First, we have home heating, where emissions have fallen just 16%. And second, and this is really the big one, cars, where emissions have fallen just 3% in 30 years. I mean, that is a staggering shortfall for what's needed. And it means that at the moment, transport is the #1 source in the UK for greenhouse gases.
So is it the government's fault?
Well, I'm going to show you a litany of government policies, carbon neutral policies that have been brought out over the decades. The issue is that many of those have been cut back or simply abandoned. And to give you an example of what the effect of that is, we can look at subsidies for loft insulation. You can see that was brought in around 2008, and it really helped the rollout of loft insulation across the UK all the way to 2012, where that subsidy was dropped, and you can see the effect. And it's not just policies that have gone by the wayside. Campaigners say here in the UK, we're simply not ambitious enough. We talked about cars being a really big problem. We're committed in the UK to stopping the production of petrol and diesel car production by 2040. But in Norway, they're doing this in 6 years' time. So the government has policies it can be proud of, but those policies are really in the past. And Whitehall is going to have to dig very deep, given climate change crisis is only getting worse, in order to create reforms that are going to move the needle.
Thanks, Elia. Well, joining me now is Charles Donovan, Director of Climate Finance at Imperial College London and a former energy policy analyst during the Clinton administration in the US. The basic charge from the protesters that this is compromised by profit and growth is true, isn't it? Because it was, George Osborne in this country who said you don't save the planet by wrecking the economy. And we can see that's what he did with policy.
Well, I think the protesters have a point, and it's a point that the climate change is real, it's serious, it has serious effects on the economy and our livelihood right now. So that part's clear. Where there's probably a surprising degree of overlap is that a lot of people in the business community are saying the exact same thing, and they are seeing impacts on the bottom line from climate change and really worried about this as well. So there's some resonance, let's say, between these messages.
But the argument is about the pace of change, isn't it?
It is. And what's being proposed about going zero carbon on the timeframes is to put it bluntly, impossible.
Why?
Because we have certain things that we have in the economy today. We have a stock of infrastructure. We have the cars we're already driving. We have the buildings we already live in, the homes that we live in. We're not going to change those overnight.
But these are choices, aren't they? I mean, if Norway can do it in 6 years, we could have done as well.
And this
Do you think these were deliberately unambitious targets by the government?
That's true. And the way we need to frame this is not about shutting down, it's about scaling up. And really what we're talking about is an investment problem of how quickly can we push the system. And the UK has some great advantages here, and it's entirely possible, but I'm not sure that the timelines that these protesters are talking about make sense.
I mean, is the truth that tackling climate change and reducing emissions is another massive casualty of the banking crisis? That recovering from 2008 meant that we weren't prepared to pay the money that was required to reduce our emissions fast enough. We weren't prepared to invest it in housing and motoring and everything else.
Well, I think that a lot of people have tried to make a connection between the two. There's certainly some issues about what is the financial system for, where is investment being directed, and how are we creating incentives for things to flow to the right kind of investment opportunities. But I think the UK is getting that. I think London is clearly one of the world's leading financial centers for green finance, but it's going to take a concerted sort of strategic view, as you've described some countries are taking.
But what does green finance mean? I mean, doesn't it usually mean, finance not in this country?
It doesn't need to. Certainly, I mean, London is well placed for financing the expansion of clean tech, renewables, carbon reduction in other countries as an international financial center, but there's no reason it shouldn't be doing that in the domestic economy as well.
If you wanted to accelerate it, if we suddenly had a change of government, these people, on the streets win, and you have a people's, government that says, right, we're going to tackle this now.
Sure.
What would you have to do?
Well, you'd have to do a number of things. You'd have to get some consensus about what are people willing to live with in terms of their lifestyle changes, and that's probably the biggest source of divergence between what you're hearing on the streets and what most people would be saying at home in terms of what they want. Because most people, I think, they want to continue to grow. They want their jobs to continue to be there, but they want that to be happening in a sustainable way. And what we're seeing now is really a cost of inaction, that the status quo is really no longer possible. So the question becomes, how can we form a consensus around the kind of growth that we want? And it's got to be more growth. It's got to be better growth. But that's the kind of conversation we need to be having.
Do we need a step change in what we regard as sustainability? What, how long we're prepared to tolerate?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we are, you and I are, and everyone in this room, we are chronically bad as individuals of taking those kinds of decisions for the long term. So this is not just companies, it's not just governments, it's really about all of us in the way that we see what is the return on the investment that I can make, what's the risk associated with making these kinds of investments in my home, for my car, in my business, and finding some support in the policy environment that says that those are going to turn out to be safe bets.
After Brexit, maybe. Charles Donovan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've been getting away